This weekend at the box office, Bad Boys for Life repeats at number 1. Meanwhile, Guy Ritchie's The Gentleman has a strong opening, and Universal's The Turning turns audiences away. All this and more on this episode of The Weekend Take.
You're listening to The Weekend Take, and now your host, Sean Schaefer.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Weekend Take. I'm your host, Sean Schaefer, and joining me this week is co-director and editor of Little Miss Westie, Joy Reid. Joy, how are you doing?
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me, Sean.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. For those of you new to the show, The Weekend Take is a weekly podcast that breaks down the weekend box office results, but also looks beyond the numbers at the talking points and trends of the film industry. We'll get started the way we do each week by looking at the films that left the top 10. The first film to leave the top 10 this week is Like a Boss from Paramount Pictures, which dropped from the number 9 position down to number 14. The film took in $1.5 million, a 62% drop from last week. It saw a theater drop of over 1,300 screens, bringing its count down to 1,723. A per-screen average of $890 brings its cum, here in its third week of release, up to $20.5 million. The other film to leave the top 10 this week was Frozen 2 from Walt Disney Studios, which dropped from the number 10 position down to number 11. The film took in $2.5 million, a 33% drop from last week. A small drop in theaters and only saw a decline of 330 screens to bring its count down to 1,750. Still a strong per-screen average at over $1,400, and here in its 10th week of release, leaving the countdown, has brought its domestic cum up to a whopping $469.8 million. So, Joy, these two films left the top 10 this week, and I mean, Frozen 2 was certainly a long-tenured film in the top 10 weeks of release. Anything stand out particularly about either of these films?
I can neither confirm nor deny anything about either one of those films, having not seen either one.
Okay. Well, I was fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on how one perceives it, that I took my 8-year-old to see Frozen 2 opening weekend because it had to happen. It's a rite of passage as a parent.
For every dad.
Yes. I thought it was a just fine film. I didn't think it was as good as the first one if I was looking at the two critically, but enjoyable nonetheless. And for Disney, it's just another film that makes them over $1 billion per picture. Seems to be their specialty now, is to churn out billion-dollar films.
Right on.
Number 10.
So with that, we'll get into our top 10. Starting off at number 10, down from number 8 this week, is Knives Out from Lionsgate. Knives Out took in $3.6 million this week, a small decline, only 14.7% drop from last week. Its theater count did not change, holding steady at 1,667 screens. A per-screen average of over $2,100 still here in its 9th week of release, and has brought its cum up to $151.8 million for the surprise sleeper hit from Lionsgate.
Number 9.
Next up at number 9, down from number 7, is Just Mercy from Warner Brothers. Just Mercy takes in $4 million this weekend, a near 30% drop from last week. The most minimal of screen drops, as it only loses 49 screens to bring its count down to 2,408. A per-screen average of almost $1,700, and here in its 5th week of release, it sees its cum hit $27 million.
Number 8.
Next up in the countdown at number 8 is Little Women from Sony Pictures, which dropped from the number 6 position down to number 8, taking in $4.7 million this weekend, only 26% drop from last week. Little Women actually saw a small increase in its theater count, gaining 25 screens to bring its count up to 2,528. A per-screen average near $1,900 per screen, and here in its 5th week of release, has brought its cum up to $93.7 million on its way to a $100 million domestic cum. Got to imagine that the nominations at the Academy Awards surely have to help, as this time of year is best for that. Typically, nominees see a good bump and spike in their box office take, and I imagine with, I believe, 6 nominations for Little Women, it has to be helpful.
Number 7.
Next up at number 7 is Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, which dropped from the number 5 position down to number 7. Star Wars takes in $5.1 million this weekend, a 37% drop from last week. The film sees a theater count drop of 258 screens to bring its count down to 2,800 screens, a per-screen average of just over $1,800 as Star Wars crosses the $500 million mark here domestically in its 6th week of release, bringing its cum to $501.5 million.
Number 6.
And lastly, to round out the bottom half of the top 10, our first new opening of the week, The Turning from Universal Pictures, which took in $7.3 million on 2,571 screens, a per screen average of just over $2,800 here in its opening frame. Now, $2,800 per screen is not the best to have opening weekend, and I can't imagine it goes anywhere but down from here looking at Rotten Tomatoes and Cinema Score. For The Turning, it has a Cinema Score of an F, which is where the outgoing audience leaving the theater gives the film a grade, and so obviously audiences leaving the theater did not particularly like The Turning. And critics don't either, as the film has a measly 12% on Rotten Tomatoes, so very much so certified rotten. And it just seems to unfortunately be the case for Finn Wolfhard, who most people know from Stranger Things, who has one of the roles in this film, The Turning. His outings outside of the Netflix show have not been particularly profitable outside of his appearance in the two It films released last year. But Joy, looking at our numbers 10 through 6, does anything stand out to you, or do you have any thoughts on these 5 films?
I actually did see one of those films. It's a small miracle, but it is true. I saw Knives Out.
I saw Knives Out as well. I thought it was a pretty stellar film, but what were your thoughts on it?
I loved it. I love anytime anybody takes a chance with a standard form of storytelling and, likes to tinker with it and turn it on its ear just a hair and see what it'll do. And I think Knives Out did just that.
It was a really good reminder to people who maybe got turned off to Rian Johnson after Star Wars The Last Jedi, to remind them that Rian Johnson is actually a very competent and talented filmmaker. He does very good work when he's not apparently in a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah. I really appreciated, there were just so many things that made it so current at the same time. I loved the little casual racism that was in the film, like nobody could remember where she was from.
Yeah.
Like all these just little beautiful social moments that were just like, hey, are you still in there? I really, really appreciated the whole spectrum.
And I also appreciated just the cast that Rian Johnson was able to assemble for this film. From top to bottom, it was amazing actors.
Indeed. Agreed.
And Knives Out has certainly been a sleeper hit for Lionsgate. I mean, they were expecting it to do well, but they were also on the fence given that people still maybe be a bit sour on Rian Johnson after Last Jedi. But this film has really been a real kind of breakout hit for the studio. And there was already talks of a sequel now, because that's what we do in Hollywood now. We make sequels to everything.
That's so sad. I mean,
$151 million domestically, another $131 million in foreign gross. So you're looking at a worldwide gross of almost $284 million on a film that had a production budget of $40 million. So quite the multiplier on that film and moneymaker for Lionsgate. But I guess the word is the sequel, if they move forward, will focus on Daniel Craig's character, which I feel is probably the only viable route.
Sure.
I mean, to just follow him on another, whodunit.
Yeah, turn him into Miss Marple,
Exactly. I'll be interested to see what a sequel could hold, and if it, I guess, holds the same level of achievement as the first one does, because the first one's always, you've got all the time in the world to put that first one out. But
right, the sophomore album is always the tough one, right?
Exactly. But with Knives Out being in the number 10 position, it is probably a film that we'll be talking about next week here on the show, having left the top 10. But I mean, much like Frozen, 10 weeks at the box office in the top 10 is not a very easily achievable feat anymore. Films seem to run out of Dodge much quicker now, and they hit streaming and home video much quicker now, it seems.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks. Number 5.
Getting into the top half of the top 10, starting with number 5. Down from number 4 this week is Jumanji: The Next Level from Sony Pictures, which took in $7.9 million, an 18% drop from last week. The film saw a small theater drop, losing 202 screens, bringing its count down to still formidable 3,121 screens here in its 7th week of release. it still has a $2,500 per screen average and has brought its cume up to $283.4 million.
Number 4.
Next up in the top 10 is our second new release of the week. Debuting at number 4 is The Gentleman from STX Entertainment, which brought in $11 million its opening weekend on 2,165 screens for a just over $5,000 per screen average. As I mentioned, its opening week of release has accumulated $11 million, which was above expectations for STX, which has had a bit of a roller coaster ride 2019 and seems to be getting off on the right foot here in 2020.
Number 3.
Next up at number 3, holding tight at number 3, is Dolittle from Universal Pictures, which brought in $12.5 million, a 42.8% drop from last week. Its theater count held steady as well at 4,155 screens, per screen average of just over $3,000, and in its second week of release has brought its cume up to $44.6 million.
Number 2.
Coming in at number 2, also holding tight at number 2, is 1917, also from Universal Pictures, taking in $15.8 million, and only 28% drop from last week. The film actually saw a theater increase, likely due to its 10 Academy Award nominations, as it brings its count up 325 screens to a total of 3,937 screens, a per screen average of just over $4,000 as it crosses the $100 million mark domestically here in its fifth week of release, bringing its cume up to $103.8 million.
Number 1.
And lastly, at number 1, for the second week in a row, is Bad Boys for Life from Sony Pictures Releasing, which took in $34 million here in its second week of release, a 45.6% drop from last week. Its theater count held steady at 3,775 screens, and it had a per-screen average of just over $9,000 per screen, and in its second week of release sees its cume rise to $120.6 million. Joy, looking at the top 5, it's quite a mixed bag from studio pictures like Jumanji and unneeded remakes like Dolittle.
Have an opinion.
Yes. To films that are meant to be cinema like 1917, and then more sequels from the studio system like Bad Boys for Life. So thoughts on our top 5?
I have no thoughts on any of the top 5. I mean, I've heard some about 1917, and it sounds like brilliant filmmaking, but I haven't seen it. I understand that is absolutely worth seeing in the theater, though.
Yes, from what I understand, it's definitely a must-see on the big screen and in the best sound system you can.
Yes, I heard that as well. I heard that the sound design was unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's shot by my personal favorite cinematographer, Roger Deakins, who's looking, fingers crossed, to repeat as the Academy Award winner for Best Cinematography this year, which would be quite interesting given that the previous 13 nominations they gave him didn't yield a victory, but he could be looking at 2 in a row, which would be amazing.
Wow.
Beyond that, yeah, I mean, I do have an opinion on things like Dolittle. I really feel at this point like Robert Downey Jr., he's done in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and he's just being Robert Downey Jr., just in a different outfit. It seems to be what he does best, but I certainly don't see much difference in performance or character style of Dolittle versus, say, when he was doing the Sherlock Holmes films with Jude Law. Right down to body language, facial gestures, they seem very similar. So I don't know. I mean, that's just, I guess, what Universal wanted to do. They seemed it was the right time to make another Dolittle film.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a generation that doesn't really know who he is, like doesn't find Rex Harris relatable.
Yeah, and still might still be too old to recall the Eddie Murphy Dr. Dolittle films either.
Right, so, remakes of remakes.
Yeah. Although I am interested to see The Gentleman. Guy Ritchie is more than competent director, and the film looks interesting and looks funny as well. I mean, he's assembled quite the cast together for that film, so I may check that out. Jumanji, to me, Jumanji's always been the Robin Williams Jumanji. So even when the first attempt at bringing back the franchise came out a couple years back, I couldn't really bring myself to see that one. And and perhaps less so now. So I don't know. And Bad Boys for Life, it's the third one. They're already talking about a fourth one. And it's just Bad Boys for Life is starting to feel like this generation's version of Lethal Weapon, where they're just getting too old for this. But what do I know? I'm not in the studios, so I don't know these things. It's interesting to see that even with two new films, numbers 1, 2, and 3 stayed the same for the second week in a row. Moving forward, I would like to see what films get bumps in their theater counts and their per screen averages thanks to award season. I mean, as I mentioned here in the top 10, we have 3 films that are Academy Award nominated pictures. Another one just outside the top 10 that we didn't get to talk about was Parasite. Got a theater bump, but it only made its way up to number 12. Hopefully it gets a further theater bump for more people to see Parasite, because I want to see it, and I've heard from many people that it is an absolute brilliant film as well. Yeah, I mean, award season always makes for a weird time at the box office, because films that have had long-standing runs suddenly pop back up and get some bolster to show off those now nominated for 10 Academy Awards.
Right.
Looking ahead to next week, there's a few releases on the horizon. For starters, there is the Rhythm Section, which is directed by Reed Morano, which I really want to see, starring Blake Lively and Jude Law. I've always been a big fan of Reed Morano's work as a cinematographer, so to see some of her directorial efforts is certainly high on my list of things to do at the theater. So that comes out wide from Paramount next week, so I definitely want to check that out. Counter programming to that, because it's winter and of course we need to release more horror films and more remakes. United Artists is putting out a Gretel and Hansel, not Hansel and Gretel, but Gretel and Hansel horror thriller. I can only imagine what that's going to be.
Oh, I'm a sucker for that. I'll be there.
I'm interested to see what they do with it and what changes they've made, because a lot of people don't realize that the grim fairy tales it's apropos to the name. Like they're grim. They can be very macabre.
Oh yeah.
It's interesting to see what they do. And another film that is coming out only limited release, and hopefully it gets expanded soon, is The Assistant, which is coming out from Bleecker Street Media. The Assistant was a big film festival hit, and I want to say it's fictionalization, but it's one of those fictionalizations you know exactly who they're talking about, which is about an assistant to a powerful studio executive, Harvey Weinstein.
Whose initials are Harvey Weinstein.
Yes, whose initials. Certainly want to check that out. Hopefully it gets an expansion beyond this limited release next week. Looking ahead at the possibilities, and I guess it's a toss-up for me whether Bad Boys for Life three-peats, which would speak so highly to the studio system, or if something like Gretel and Hansel or Rhythm Section come out and dethrone it from the number 1 position. I'd like to think that Rhythm Section will. I know these films don't particularly play to your interests, but do you think we see Bad Boys at number 1 again, or do you think...
To tell you the truth, I don't even know what Bad Boys is about. Like I'm that illiterate as far as what's out right now.
Picture Lethal Weapon, but with Will Smith and Martin Lawrence instead.
Okay. All right.
And this is the third one. And this is the one where they're like, one last ride. And then the studio's like, the opening weekend was huge. You guys are going on another last ride in a couple of years.
Right. So now I get it. It's like Die Hard.
Yeah, it's like that. So
yeah, that's okay. So just to put it in some context, why I don't know this is films that have a lot of explosions put me to sleep. And I'm not saying like they bore me. I'm saying like I will snore in the theater and embarrass myself. And you know, even if I want to stay awake, I can't. There's something about all those explosions in a theater. I think I just shut down and I fall asleep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll give you 2 words that can sum up what Bad Boys is. Ready? Michael Bay.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No.
Michael Bay creates the Bad Boys franchise.
Not for me. I'm glad for the people who enjoy him. I'm not going to yuck anyone else's yum, but so not for me.
So next week, I think it'll be a bit of a toss-up. I'm hoping one of the newcomers, preferably Rhythm Section, can dethrone Bad Boys, which seems odd to say because Rhythm Section does have a fair amount of action to it, but I don't think it's like Michael Bay levels of action. At least the trailer doesn't lead me to believe that. It's more kind of espionage, like thriller action, but we'll see. That's next week. For this week, that about wraps it up for us here on this episode of The Weekend Take. Joy, if someone wants to check out you or some of your work, how would they best do that?
Go to my website at ohmyproductions.com, or you can check out Little Miss Westy at lmwdoc.com, and we're also on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at lmwdoc.
Great, and like I said, I'll be sure to put some pertinent links in the episode description. Be sure to check out The Weekend Take. We are also on social media at www.facebook.com/The Weekend Take. We are also on Twitter at The Weekend Take. And be sure to check out our Patreon campaign at www.patreon.com/The Weekend Take, where for as little as $1 per month, you can become a patron of The Weekend Take and get exclusive access to extended cuts of episodes in case you want to hear more of the conversation that Joy and I had today or any of our previous guests. You also get early access to episodes, and starting this season, you get exclusive Patreon patron episodes as well. And you also get a Weekend Take sticker to show us off to your friends. That wraps it up for us this week. Joy, again, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Always, always. Thanks so much for having me.
And for everyone listening, I hope you have a great week ahead, and we will catch you all next week. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Weekend Take. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes and Google Play, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.